Bon dia a tothom. Presentaré la següent ponent, que, com alguns de vosaltres ja sabeu, es tracta de Trudy Peterson, que és nascuda a Iowa, als Estats Units d'Amèrica, i és consultora d'arxius internacional i arxivera certificada. Durant 4 anys, Trudy Peterson va treballar als Arxius Nacionals dels Estats Units i des de l'any 93 al 95, és a dir, més de 2 anys, va ocupar el càrrec d'arxivera nacional dels Estats Units a Washington. Després de deixar el govern d'aquell país, va ser fundadora i directora executiva de la Open Society Archives a Budapest i, posteriorment, directora dels serveis de gestió documental i arxius de l'ACNUR, que a nosaltres procediment ens sona, entre altres coses, perquè la nostra companya, Montserrat Canela, hi està treballant en aquests moments i va treballar-hi també quan Trudy Peterson era la directora. L'ACNUR, és a dir, l'Alt Comissionat per als Refugiats de les Nacions Unides. Als anys 1990 i 1991 va ser presidenta de la Society of American Archivists. Als anys 93 al 95 va ser presidenta de la CITRA, la Conferència Internacional de la Table Ronde des Arxius, i del 2005 al 2013 membre de l'ESPA, la secció d'associacions professionals del Consell Internacional d'Arxius, que va ser on vaig tenir la sort de conèixer-la i participar en múltiples reunions també a molts països del món. Actualment ella és presidenta del grup de treball sobre drets humans del Consell Internacional d'Arxius i presideix també un grup de treball del mateix organisme sobre accés a la documentació dels arxius, les recomanacions de les quals van ser aprovades en el darrer congrés a Brisbane l'agost de l'any passat. Va participar com a consultora en les comissions de la veritat creades a Sud-àfrica i Hondures i també en el Tribunal Especial de Sierra Leona, assessorant la seva política d'accés i d'arxius. A Guatemala ha treballat durant més de 3 anys en la formació del personal que gestiona els arxius de la policia d'aquell país. Naturalment, aquest currículum es completa amb una gran multitud de publicacions i conferències i amb moltes intervencions arxivístiques arreu del món que podeu verificar en la seva pàgina web, que s'hi accedeix sense cap dificultat a partir de Google. A nivell més personal, permeteu-me que digui que Trudy Peterson és una bona amiga i especialment és una molt bona amiga dels arxivers de Catalunya. Sense aquesta amistat us puc assegurar que no s'entendria la seva presència avui aquí al nostre congrés. El seu Parlament se centrarà en posar de relleu la funció dels arxius en l'enfortiment de la democràcia i us puc assegurar que tenim la sort de tenir avui aquí una de les arxiveres més brillants del panorama internacional. Per tant, moltes gràcies, Trudy. Tens la paraula.
Thank you very much, Joan, and thank you for inviting me to be here again in beautiful Barcelona. It's always a pleasure to come to this wonderful city and this wonderful region. I want to talk today about the role of archives in strengthening democracy. Let me begin by showing you a picture. This is a British Army intelligence officer. This picture was taken at the border in Kosovo after that brutal spring in 1999. You will probably remember that at that time, the Serbian army had forced most Kosovars to flee from their homes across the border south into Macedonia or west into Albania. And at the border, the army officers stripped the Kosovars of every document they carried. They took identity cards, passports, documents showing where you were employed. They even took the license plates off the vehicles. Why? So you couldn't come back and prove that you were a citizen. You couldn't prove you lived in this apartment. You couldn't prove you were a member of this institution and so your pension was guaranteed. you were essentially a non-person. So how would it be that if you were stripped of documents, it would be the easiest to reconstruct who you are? Through archives, of course. And that's where we come in as archivists in the question of a transitional situation in which you have gone from a more to a less repressive regime, from a period of civic trauma, from the aftermath of war. As you will see here, this British officer is sitting literally on a pile of passports and identity cards that the British found after the movement back into Kosovo of the Kosovars. Now, some questions come very quickly in a transitional situation. What happened to my husband? I have a friend in Guatemala. She and her husband and her father went to a hardware store. She and her father stayed in their pickup. Her husband went into the store. He's never been seen again. So that happens very quickly. The second sort of thing, when you have a little period of time in a transition, seems to be, how did we get into this mess anyway? How did this happen among us? And then much later come questions like, why do all of us who live downwind from nuclear tests have such a high rate of cancer? And so there's a time period that we find these questions recurring. Now, as we know, the questions of right to know government information have been basic questions of the last half of the 20th century. And most governments around the world have now adopted some sort of a freedom of information law. In the post-Cold War period, this becomes an international question. In 1993, the UN Commission on Human Rights appointed a special rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression, essentially oral. I can say what I think. But as he began to look at this and look at the questions, he started to say, being able to say what you think is not enough. And so his 1997 report said, in addition, governments need to fully promote and protect the right to seek and receive information. And he said it was a fundamental prerequisite to ensure public participation. Now, at the same time, and remember we're after the Cold War, we're after the changes in Eastern Europe, most of the dictatorships in Central and South America have fallen by now. The Commission starts to be concerned also that there was a trend in governments just to say, let's go forward. There's immunity for the crimes that were committed during the repressive period. So they then appoint another special rapporteur, this one on what do we do to combat impunity of perpetrators. And they appointed a French jurist named Louis Joinet, who drafted a statement against impunity. It has been updated in 2005, so the latest version is the 2005 version. And this set of principles were, to I think almost every archivist's surprise, heavily reflective of the importance of archives in combating impunity. Joinet didn't come at this as an archivist. He came at it as a lawyer, using records to prove something. But he said, look, there is this right to know, just as the other rapporteur on freedom of expression had said. So it's the same year. The two rapporteurs are saying the same thing to the international community. But he said that a person has a right to know what happened, a right to know the truth, but he also said that society as a whole has a right to know and a responsibility to remember, and that the state has a responsibility here. I'm going to read you just one little paragraph. The right to know is also a collective right, drawing upon history to prevent violations from recurring in the future. Its corollary is a duty to remember, which the state must assume in order to guard against the perversions of history that go under the names of revisionism or negationism. The knowledge of the oppression it has lived through is part of a people's national heritage and must be preserved. Now, I think it's very important that as part of the measures, the state must ensure the preservation of and access to archives concerning the violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And notice it does not say the state has to ensure the preservation of state archives. This says archives. The system of archives in the country must encompass both state and non-state records and personal papers if they have some information concerning violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And in this way, we finally have the link between expression and opinion, the right to get information, archives, and human rights. This is the complete link now. Now, what was the International Council on Archives doing? In 1993, at the International Council on Archives meeting in Mexico City, there was a demand that came spontaneously from the floor for advice on how to deal with the archives of security services. And you heard it from Peru, and you heard it from Argentina, and you heard it from countries in Eastern Europe, all of whom were starting to say, we have to do something about this. So a representative of UNESCO was in the room. He said they would fund a study, and out of it came the important 1995 study led by Antonio González Quintana, but having an international group, somebody from Russia, somebody from the US, someone from France, someone from South America, who came up with a study which was the first systematic international attempt to look at what to do with the records of these institutions. So, the next thing that happens is after the Balkan Wars are over, and after the war in Guatemala is over, and there has been a truth commission there and lots of problems, Swiss peace, because Switzerland had worked heavily in these two conflicts, Balkans and Central America, developed an analysis of the demands that are made for dealing with the past. And this is the Swiss peace model. And it shows that in the center, we've got the victims and the perpetrators. And what we're trying to get to is the transformation of the conflict through making sure there's no impunity, there's no repetition, there's rule of law and reconciliation. And to do that, they say, governments and citizens typically have to engage in 4 different activities. And I'm going to go through these really quickly, then I'm going to come back to each of the four and talk about them in terms of what archives help get us through these processes. So, next, okay. Here's the four categories. A right to justice, no impunity. This is the Joannet principle. Institutional reform, no recurrence. We don't go back. We have a right to know that's individual and societal, and then a right to reparations. So, in the right to justice, no impunity, you have prosecuting those persons who have been perpetrators, protecting witnesses, and then monitoring trials to make sure they're fair. In institutional reform, no recurrence. To rebuild government structures, to rebuild courts, and yes, to rebuild archives, because archives in many repressive situations have also been twisted by the demands of the regime. And then vetting of public officials, that is, looking at their credentials, looking at what they did during the former regime to see if they should serve in the new government, or whether their service would undermine the steps forward that the society is trying to take. The fourth, then, is the right to know, both locating the missing and telling the truth about what happened. And fourth, the right to reparations, that is, restitution, if it can be property or other things, and then moral and material compensation. And in all of these, we use archives, and it makes us as archivists duty bearers for human rights. So let me look now at each of these four in terms of archives. This is a picture I took. This is the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And as Joanne said in the introduction, I've done a lot of work with the Special Court. But it shows us that this demand for justice met through these prosecutions is an important part of where we need to go. By the way, in Sierra Leone, at the time the war started, the war went on for about 12 years. The population was about 5 million, and about 50,000 were killed. It just gives you a sense of how devastating that war was. Now, we have prosecutions in domestic courts, hybrid courts, and international courts. The first successful domestic prosecution of a head of state leave Fujimori aside, that's slightly different, but the prosecution of Rios Montt that just concluded in Guatemala held Rios Montt guilty for genocide against an Ixil Maya group, a particular part of the Maya population. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. On a technicality, just this week, it's been overturned and sent back to the lower court to repeat part of the trial. But he was convicted. And it gives you a sense of the goods and the bads about prosecution as an answer to transitional justice. The good is he was held accountable for genocide against that population, and that is to be celebrated. The bad is, of course, he was prosecuted for not what he did to the whole Maya population, and not what he did to Guatemala, but for one part of the Maya population of Guatemala. Very narrow case in that sense. Hybrid courts are those in which you have both domestic and UN and international UN chosen, typically, judges and prosecutors in the cases. Special Court for Sierra Leone is a hybrid court. the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia, which have been prosecuting the Cambodians of the Pol Pot regime, is another hybrid court. The true international courts are totally staffed then by international judges, prosecutors, and defenders. International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and the International Criminal Court. Prosecutors in each of these cases need to understand the organizational structures of the country, and particularly those of the institutions that were the employers of the people who are being prosecuted. They need to understand both the extent of the activity, they need to understand the territory in which it's authorized to operate, they need to understand relationships, and they need to understand them over time. For example, in Guatemala, sometimes the police was independent of the army, sometimes it was subordinate to the army. That makes a difference in prosecution. And if the records of this organization are already in the archives, the archival description, the content and context of those records make it possible for prosecutors to use what we know and what we have described in order to carry out the prosecutions. Because, as we all know, we describe records in context and content terms, and that context term is what they need to understand. Now, also in prosecutions, we see an enormous variety of records used, and they will use whatever kinds of material are pertinent to the case. Now, obviously, records of government are typically where they begin, and they will use records of military, security services, and so forth. They'll use records of non-governmental organizations. They'll use records of churches. They'll use records of businesses, schools, hospitals, morgues, cemeteries. Copies of radio and television broadcasts. In the International Tribunal for Rwanda, the broadcasts of the infamous Radio Mille Collines were keys to a trial which tried broadcasters for increasing the hatred and stirring people to commit genocide. Personal papers are also used, and these are increasingly important. To everyone's surprise, when the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia finally managed to capture Ratko Mladic, the military commander during the war, he kept a diary. And they got the diary when they seized the material where he was. It's unbelievable to me that a military man would keep a diary, but he did. And that personal paper, that diary, is now part of the records that are being used by the International Tribunal to prosecute him. Increasingly, too, we are seeing personal videos being available to prosecutors. It was an absolute sensation in the trials in the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia when a video that was taken by a member of a death squad called the Scorpions was played, because this man had a handheld camera and he took pictures of the other people in his unit killing 6 Bosnians. And it was not only a sensation in the court, but it was a sensation back in Serbia, because it started to say, we can't deny that it was our boys who did it. Prosecutors have also had some help from records of international organizations, UNHCR and so forth. And to some extent, I think that you could imagine them using records of, say, NGOs that are working in a conflict area and reporting back to their headquarters, records of missionaries working and reporting back to their church headquarters, because these are people who are not part of either side of the conflict. And they've got a third party's view of what was going on. Also, governments that were not part of the conflict often have people on the ground reporting back. In the case of the prosecution of Fujimori in Peru, records of the US diplomats in Peru reporting on what they were being told by the Fujimori government were crucial in that prosecution. Also, some tribunals are using satellite photography. This has been used in the trials in the former Yugoslavia to show where mass graves were dug, then where mass graves were dug up, and the bodies were buried in other places. Those have been very important documents. Finally, captured records are an important source in some cases. They were certainly very important in the trials in Nuremberg. Court monitoring is a little different. It is brave people sitting in those courtrooms trying to make sure that the trials are fair. But really good monitors also use historical records in a country to show that, for example, anytime a case was brought by a minority population, it was never investigated, or the person was always convicted. Just recently in the United States, Human Rights Watch took police records from Washington, D.C. To look at how cases that were linked to domestic violence and how women's complaints were treated. Not quite a transitional justice situation, but again, monitoring what is going on to see how we can make a change. Then there's the institutional reform and the promotion of non-recurrence. This to me looks like everybody's idea of a South American general, but it's not. It's a picture from South Africa, and the original is owned by my university, so I feel comfortable in using it. I'm not going to talk about reforming archives in transitional justice situations. That's a whole different talk. But I do want to talk about vetting. That is, looking at the person's past to see if they are suitable to be employed in the new government. For vetting, of course, the easiest thing to do is to use personnel records. Now, it's wise to be skeptical of records of a previously repressive regime, but usually personnel records are a little more reliable than most. And it's because we, as employees, want to make sure our personnel records are right, because that's how we get leave, that's how we get sick leave, that's how we get a pension, that's how our accident on the job is recorded, so we know we've got a medical profile and might get paid for that as we retire. And so it's sort of self-policing, and personnel records tend to be a little more reliable than others. But there are lots of additional sources for vetting anywhere. In the case of the process in Germany after the Second World War, as you may know, records of many of the Nazi organizations were collected into something called the Berlin Document Center. And as the changes occurred, Germany is reunified, there's increased pressure to turn these records back to German control. They had been under Allied control ever since the Second World War. And the agreement was because everyone was not sure how the reunification would go, that these would all be microfilmed. Remember, we're still in the 1980s, early 1990s, and that a copy would be deposited with the U.S. National Archives as a security copy. And that was done. And just to give you a sense of how big these are, it's on 37,000 rolls of 1,000 image microfilm. It's 37 million images that was used in the vetting process in Germany. Just now, this past month, we've seen the consequences of not vetting. The new president of Moldova, recently elected, was known to have been a judge during the period when Moldova was an SSR. But what was not known was that he was the judge who sentenced probably the most prominent dissident in Moldova to mental institutions where he was basically destroyed. He wasn't killed, he did get out, but his health and his mind were broken. And that was a sentence imposed for anti-Soviet comments by the man who is now president of Moldova. Gives us a sense of why vetting is an important element. Now, if you can't, for some reason, use the personnel records, or you think they are in some way tainted, then there are lots of other records that can be used, police records, court records, lots of others. Now we move from prosecution and clearance to truth and the right to know. This is another picture I took. This is the police archives in Guatemala, September 2005, when I first saw them. It's wet because the skylight above us is broken. It's raining on me. You can see those are piles of card files. This is just paper sitting on the wet floor. That's water there. And up here is, believe it or not, some old computer disks. We have bird and other things on top of it. We have mold. And while I was taking the picture, a bat came and dive-bombed my head. It's the only time I've been in what was said to be an archive and been dive-bombed by a bat. So this is the way they can look if you find them. Now, truth-seeking takes many forms, and the most basic is the search for missing persons. When the Truth Commission in Peru reported about 10 years ago, I remember vividly there was an inquiry of a man on the street being asked by a reporter, "What do you think of the Truth Commission report?" And he said, "Doesn't tell me what happened to my brother." That's what the search for the missing is all about. Again, here you have to understand the organizational structure. And they use the broadest possible sources of records. Usually, truth commissions have to begin with the records that have been accumulated by an NGO because the government won't help. Eventually, some truth commissions get government records, but lots of them don't. South Africa finally did in a very limited way, and they had to turn them back. Guatemala, the police said, "We've destroyed all our records." As you can see from the previous slide, that was a lie, but they didn't get them. But again, if you're going to try to locate missing people, you need to understand who is likely to have had a hand in the missing person's disappearance. And to do that, you need to really think, as I call it, the temporality of the event. What happened before he disappeared? What probably happened during the disappearance? For example, in Guatemala, the police were often instructed to block a street at the two ends so somebody could then be snatched off the street. And then what happened afterwards? In a prison, were they fingerprinted? Were they photographed? Were they harmed and so they were taken to a hospital? Were they passed from the police to the military? And is there a document that shows that exchange? All of those things are possible and are possibly in the records of the organizational structures that were part of the event. So we have this link of the organizational structures and the event to the records. Certainly some of the locating missing persons comes about because bodies have been exhumed. And I don't pretend to tell you in Spain about exhuming bodies. You've done more of it, I think, than almost anyone else. But again, today, DNA is the first step on exhumation projects, but a lot of times if you can't get DNA, either the family will not provide it, or in the case in the Guatemala highlands where the whole family is killed and there's no one, then medical records are used to support exhumations. I'll tell you two quick stories. Yesterday's International Herald Tribune had a long article on the people who come across the southwest border of the United States illegally and try to get into the United States. And it's desert, and a lot of people die because of lack of water. And so they keep picking up these, unfortunately, bones, and they don't know how to begin to identify them. They're mostly Central Americans, and so the police in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico ask people whose family is missing, often for dental records, because that's the fastest and easiest way to do matches. Another one that happened in the special court in Sierra Leone was the only person that they indicted but did not arrest was a man named Johnny Paul Caroma. And there were repeated stories that he was dead. And some people believed it, and some people thought he was alive. But the court kept getting tips that there are bones out here, and this is Johnny Paul. And they would go out and dig them up, but the Caroma family would never give them any DNA to work with. And so far as anyone knows, there were no medical records extant. So you ended up with this position where you either believed or did not believe that Johnny Paul Caroma was dead. Truth commissions, it's the widest possible use of records because they are not limited as you are in court by the rules of evidence or in vetting, which is usually set up with some very specific rules by the government, or, as we'll see in a minute, the proofs that are demanded in claims. Truth commissions are trying to get an amorphous body of information together to try to say what happened among us. Everything is used. As I said, it often begins with NGOs, but you get radio and television broadcasts, you get records of international organizations, you get personal papers. I just talked to a woman who was on the commission that was set up by the UN to look at the violence in Sri Lanka and the claims of the Tamil Tigers of abuses by the government. And she said they were overwhelmed by photographs from personal cameras. And yet that's a very difficult thing to use. You don't have typically place, name. You may have a date on that camera image, but it's very hard to verify, as you're seeing by all the video that's coming out of Syria right now. Most truth commissions also take extensive oral testimonies, sometimes in the thousands. The first Burundi commission took an estimated 6,000 interviews, but often they're in the hundreds to thousands of interviews, all of which are captured typically orally, may or may not be transcribed as well. One of the interesting cases right now is a Truth Commission that's in Canada. And this is a Truth Commission that's looking at the treatment of Native American or First Peoples children when they were taken from their families and put in schools from the late 19th century to the late 20th century to turn them into good little Canadians. We did it in the US also. Ours ended a little earlier than Canada's did, but in the US these were government-run schools. In Canada, they basically contracted with churches to run the schools. And so for that Truth Commission, government records are important, but church records are crucial because it's the churches who ran the schools. And so it's a very different sort of Truth Commission where church records from a number of different faiths become central to the investigation. Restitution and the right to reparation. I didn't take this. This is the 1954 nuclear test explosion in the Marshall Islands, where I'm currently working. And so I put it in as an example of the kind of thing that restitution and reparation deals with. Now, the aim here is to provide redress for harm that's been suffered. And that can take many forms. It can be official apologies. For example, Australia each year has an official Sorry Day where they tell the Aboriginal people how sorry they are for how the Aborigines were treated. Memorials, commemorations, these are all reparations to society as a whole. And these usually can be done without records. But when you get to restitution, compensation, rehabilitation on an individual level, records and archives are crucial. Now, in December of 2005, the United Nations adopted a resolution on the basic principles and guidelines for reparation and restitution. And restitution is officially to restore the victim to the original situation before the gross violations. If this relates to ownership of property, for example, you need to know who owned what. At the High Commissioner for Refugees, where I worked and where Montserrat is now the chief archivist, we had all the records of the Uganda Asians that were expelled by Idi Amin. And there was a commission set up to develop for them a list of the properties that they had that were taken from them, the houses that were taken, the pensions they were owed, and so forth. So who owned what? If it is to be a return of property, and it's real property, then we need land records, we need notarial records, we need cartographic records. The latter two, notarial and cartography, are especially important if it was sort of a forced transfer, whereas if it's a government seizure, you have government records that are involved. If we're talking about seizure of personal property, the famous cases, of course, are the art seized from Jewish persons during the Nazi period. All kinds of records are useful, and everything from insurance claims to sale records in art galleries and so forth. Now, if the issue is restoring citizenship or restoring the right to vote or employment, and many people in these situations are not only jailed, but their right to vote is taken from them, or their citizenship is stripped. Then we need all sorts of things: birth, death, and marriage records, we need employment records, we need court records, to begin to say, this person is owed a pension, this person can vote, this person is a citizen, and these records indeed are crucial for those. Oops. Come on, there we go. If, however, you cannot directly restore, someone's health is broken, then you turn to compensation, and that's payment for economically accessible damage. Let me give you two things that I've just been working on. First, I'm just back from the Philippines, and the Philippines has passed a law that will compensate people whose human rights were violated during the period of the Marcos dictatorship from 1972 to 1986. And the very complicated law shows that first you must prove how you were harmed, so the event, and then if you've died, your heirs are eligible for compensation. So you would have a second proof that you have to show that you are the son or daughter or widow or widower. So it's a very complicated process that's going to require records that NGOs kept on human rights violations during the period, as well as any government records that can be obtained and link those together to begin to figure out the list of people who will be compensated from the body of money that's available. The money comes from Swiss bank accounts of Ferdinand Marcos that were frozen at the end of the regime and have been returned to the Philippine government with the proviso that 1/3 of the money be used to compensate the victim. So that's how the money is there. The other one is the Nuclear Claims Tribunal in the Marshall Islands. And there, when the Marshall Islands became independent in 1986, the U.S. gave the Marshall Islands $150 million and said, settle the rest of the claims for damages, principally to health, but also to livelihoods and land and fishes and palm trees that occurred as a result of the more than 50 above-ground nuclear tests that the U.S. conducted in the Marshall Islands in the decade after the Second World War. And in that case, again, you had to figure out what was the damage. So here, hospital records and medical records were critical. And people came in with medical records from Manila and medical records from Honolulu. And those then became, these were analyzed by medical professionals working for the tribunal, who then gave plain language to the judges and the defendant and the advocate to work out what the claim would be. So there are all kinds of records that are needed for these kinds of situations. One I was personally involved in the 80s. As you may know, during the Second World War, the U.S. put our Japanese citizens into camps far from the coasts. And they were forced out of homes, livelihood. It's an awful story. And in the late 80s, the government finally agreed to compensate those persons who had been put into the camps. In the U.S. National Archives, we had old computer punch cards that had been used at the time to list who was in the camp. These weren't very sophisticated, but they were the old punch cards. And we couldn't read them. We had them. And they had enough up on the top you knew who it was. It was written, the name and a couple of things. But we managed to find a computer company that indeed still had a machine and could get us an electronic version. So we actually had then the electronic version that we could work with of who the government believed was in the camps. Meanwhile, for years, Japanese American non-government organizations had been making their own lists of who was in the camps, especially two principal ones. So what happened was the government's record and the NGO's records were put together to see how they matched and then develop the final list of people who were going to be compensated. So again, government records were important, but private sector were too. Now, a final comment. It's really important to preserve the records of these institutions that deal with the transitional justice issues. These are typically not continuing government bodies. A truth commission is set up, does its report, and dies. A compensation commission is set up, does its work, and dies. A special court, like the Special Tribunal for Rwanda, ends. The Special Court for Sierra Leone ends. And we archivists have to make sure that these incredibly important records are preserved. Some of them are, of course, are going to be a state decision because these are state bodies. We can pressure, but it does become a political decision in the state who is going to take over the management of these records. And if you want in the question and answer, we can talk about some options, but there are different patterns. The one crucial thing, we want it maintained as a whole. Unfortunately, in the Philippines, they took their Truth Commission records and they split it up among the various regions of the country, and some of them got lost, some got eaten by termites, and so we don't have a single body of Truth Commission records to deal with. But it's absolutely essential that these incredibly important records for the history of a country, and I'd say for the history of all of us as people who go around the world, are preserved. It's important to note, too, I think, that to the best of my knowledge, no country has ever had all four of these: a prosecution, a vetting, a truth commission, and a compensation committee. Many countries have had two, some have had three. I don't think anybody's ever had four. But in those countries where you've got multiple ones of these, it really is essential that they get preserved and protected. So what do we have to do? Well, as duty bearers, we have to weigh the human rights uses when appraising the records. I'm trying to appraise the records right now of the Nuclear Claims Tribunal. There's lots of back and forth as to what we should save, but we really do still have to do appraisal on these because there are things like buying computer paper and hiring the repairman for the computers. We have to understand that the right to know includes the right to know what is in the archives, even if the archives are closed to the general public. If you need them for a human rights purpose, we have to be prepared to give access for a human rights purpose. That's in the ICA Principles on Access to Archives, which we took from the Joannet Principles Against Impunity. And our access points, the description and the legal authorization, are key because by the way we describe them, we can make this process harder or easier, and we can really help make these transitional justice processes move forward. Now, it is true that there are people, and we heard about that this morning, who say, turn the page. I always use Spain as the best example of this. Turn the page and the page does not stay turned. But this is the man who is the number 2 in the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, they had that same pressure. Why are you doing this? And he said, look, it is necessary to go forward. It is necessary to turn the page of history. But first, we needed to read that page. And we in the archives, we have those pages. And it's our responsibility and it's our glory that we preserve them. Thank you.